Greetings gamers, my name is Anto, and over the course of this year I've been diving into Pathfinder 2nd edition and learning all the elements of the game, and I finally got to play my very first game of Pathfinder 2nd edition recently, and I thought I'd talk to you about my experience. Does it hold up to everything that I've read and all my assumptions about the system? How does it compare to being a player in 5th edition? And what else did I find while I was going through that first session? So let's dive into it. Now, in my initial video about Pathfinder 2nd edition, which you can see up here, all of my thoughts and feelings on the system came from the point of view of the GM. This is the system that I plan on running, so all of my ideas and what I liked about it came from that GM focused point of view. So I was really interested to see how I would feel about the system coming into it as a player. I have a lot more experience as a GM than I actually do as a player. I am a forever GM. I don't get to play all that often, but this year I have actually been playing a lot more. I've played 5e in some one-shots, I've played Pathfinder 1st edition in some one-shots, and now I've played Pathfinder 2nd edition, so I have a little bit of a compare and contrast between certainly those three systems to look at and see what was good about each, what I liked about each, and what I maybe didn't like about them. So I don't want to bury the lead here. The headline news is of the three fantasy systems that I played this year, 5e, Pathfinder 1 and Pathfinder 2. Pathfinder 2, by far my favourite to play as a player. I'm going to dive into all of the reasons behind that, but ultimately it comes down to freedom of choice. The 3-action economy in Pathfinder 2nd edition might not seem radically different to a lot of other systems. In 1st edition Pathfinder you had a move and an action. In 5e you get your move and your action, and a lot of the times what you do with that move and action will be the same as the kind of things that you do with your 3 actions in Pathfinder 2nd edition. But then a lot of other times you can do a lot more. You've got more minute flexibility. So in Pathfinder 2nd edition, I am playing a Goblin Thaumaturge. Now, Thaumaturges they're like Van Helsing.
The laws of men mean little to me.
They're monster hunters, they're masters of esoteric lore, they're really cool. It's by far my favourite class. But their role on the battlefield is kind of, I would say, a midline fighter. They're not frontline like the fighter or the barbarian, but they're certainly not backline fighters. They're not too squishy, and they have some combat capabilities. So at first I thought I was going to be there on the front line swinging away like a madman, but that's not actually what ended up happening. The Thaumaturge has got a bunch of abilities that specifically debuff enemies, and I found that most of my joy came from using those abilities to debuff enemies. So the 3 primary ways that I did this was using the exploit vulnerability class feature that lets you use your knowledge of esoteric lore to find a weakness in your opponent and exploit their vulnerabilities. So if a monster is, let's say, immune to fire, you can recognize that and then you can deal specific fire damage to that creature. If a monster doesn't have a specific weakness, you can create one which is based on your level and some other numbers, and you give them a custom weakness, so you do extra damage to them. And that's where one of the really cool things I like about Pathfinder 2nd edition comes in. So to exploit this vulnerability, it's a skill check, it's an esoteric lore check, which means there are 4 degrees of success. You have what happens on a critical success, a regular success, a failure, and a critical failure. And when you're using this ability as a Thaumaturge, it's only on the critical failure that nothing happens. If you fail your normal roll, you still get to impart a smaller amount of weakness to that creature, so you still get a benefit from it. This was incredibly satisfying as the Thaumaturge player, because it meant whenever I was using this, it was very, very unlikely that nothing would come of it. Even if I didn't get the ideal result, I was still going to get some benefit that helped me and my teammates target this enemy. The other way that I, as the Thaumaturge, was using my class features to my advantage was with the ability Divine Disharmony. This essentially allows the Thaumaturge to combine some religious iconography in a way that is particularly jarring.
The power of the Christ compels you! The power of the Christ compels you!
And it imparts the flat-footed condition on your enemies. The flat-footed condition gives the enemy a -2 to their armor class, so it makes it easier to hit them, and you get that for either until the end of your current round on a success, or the next round or your next turn on a critical success. Not quite as effective as the exploit vulnerability, because if you fail or get a critical fail, you're still not going to do anything with this, but you can stack the kind of penalties from the flat-footed with the third kind of pillar of what I built my character around, which was intimidation. So I talked in my initial overview of Pathfinder 2nd Edition about the skills system in Pathfinder 2e compared to 5e, and how the skills are much more robust and useful in combat. And one of the main skills that I chose to focus this character on was intimidation. I knew that with intimidation, you can try and demoralize your enemies and frighten them, which imparts status penalties to them, which means they're just worse at everything. So I went really hard in on the intimidation on my class. I put a whole bunch of points in it.
You fear me!
So every time we were coming across a new enemy, I was trying to intimidate them, to frighten them. So it would mean that they had a worse attack bonus, all their save DCs would be lower, their armor class would get lowered by this penalty. So when you combined this with the flat-footed from the Divine Disharmony, I could make it so that they could have up to a -4 on their AC for my one attack that turn. So when you combine all of these things together with the 3 action economy, I had kind of 3 non-attacking pillars that I could choose from depending on the situation, and make it so that my attacks were much more likely to hit and therefore much more likely to crit because of that critical success system in PF2. As long as you roll 10 or above the target number, it's a critical success. This combination meant that I was slaughtering the main enemies that we were coming across. Now, we played this adventure over the course of 2 sessions. Right at the end of our first session, we came across a fire-breathing boar that was certainly pitched as being quite a strong enemy. I ran up to it, used my exploit vulnerability, showed it a string of pig's ears and some bacon to impart a status condition upon it, make it weak against my attacks, and then I intimidated it to reduce its kind of ACs and all of its abilities, and then I stabbed it and I got a critical hit, and I managed to just in one blow kill this creature because I'd demoralized it so much, I'd exploited its weaknesses, and then I got a critical hit. Then in our second session, we were fighting ogres and owlbears and a bunch of bigger monsters, and by using that combination of intimidation or creating flat-footed conditions or exploiting the weaknesses of my enemies, using all of those things to make my one attack a turn as effective as it could be, meant that I was getting crits left and right compared to what I'm used to, and we were slaughtering our way through these creatures. So even though I was attacking less than I might have been in a 5th edition game, it felt much more impactful. I recently played a 5th edition game where I ran my Barbarian Blaze, who I've played across multiple games, and I felt like I was doing nothing. We were fighting creatures that could fly and had different kind of immunities to things, so a lot of my specific abilities were just kind of nullified by the enemies. And yeah, I had a bunch of attacks and I had a really big axe, but I would stand and swing, and if I missed one or both of those swings, I felt utterly useless every single turn. Whereas in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, even though I was attacking less often, because I had all of these other interesting abilities, I was always doing something and felt a sense of achievement every turn, and I was making my attacks much more effective. So the 3 action economy, big tick from me. Absolutely loved it. So I've been incredibly happy this week, and one of the reasons is the first print-proof copy of my book, the SIDEQuest Annual, has finally arrived, and now the late pledges for this book are open. We recently funded this beautiful book over on Kickstarter. This is just a print-proof, so it's not complete yet, but we do still have almost 200 pages of content, a year's worth of magazines, 12 issues of SideQuest bound together and available in print for the first time. It's looking gorgeous. You can see all the art and the text is looking amazing. I am very, very happy with this. The late pledge is going to be available until December 14th. There'll be a link down in the description below. So if you want to get your hands on the best possible quality version of this book, or the special edition version, which I'll put a picture of right here, and it looks incredible, go ahead and click that link below. But for now, back to the video. So I'm a big fan of the 3 action economy in PF2 versus something like Pathfinder 1st Edition or D&D 5e. And overall, I've got to say, I just really enjoyed the flexibility and how much choice there was and how we could work together as a team, as the party, to get a better result. So as I mentioned, a lot of my abilities specifically gave debuffs to the enemies or gave buffs to friendlies, and working together to say, oh, this enemy is frightened, so they've got a penalty on all of their ability checks and their stats, so you're less likely to get hit, or you're more likely to hit it, or oh, I flat-footed this thing, so I'll attack this thing, you focus on other creatures because I've got a better chance of hitting this now, or giving things custom weaknesses, or learning things about the monster. Say, hey, this thing's weak to fire, I'm gonna then make my abilities target that fire resistance, but if you've got fire as well, you can target this and we can really go in and exploit the vulnerability of this creature. Worked incredibly well. As you'd expect in any RPG, I think every character has a kind of default set of abilities that they fall back on. So for me, it was frightening creatures, exploiting their vulnerabilities, using the divine disharmony before getting in a single really powerful strike against them. But other classes would settle into different options. So the rogue, obviously always going to try and get a sneak attack. You're always trying to hide, always trying to catch things flat-footed against you so that you can get that sneak attack damage. So no matter what class you play, there's always going to be a kind of default set of actions that you're going to take on a turn if you don't know what else to do. But then between the 3-action economy, all of the skill systems, all of the options you get as just your character, you have a lot of scope to go, right, I'm not going to do my default this turn, I'm going to do something interesting. I think the most interesting thing that I did in our second session was we were fighting an ogre, and he was kicking our ass. He was absolutely beating us. I was almost dead. Things weren't looking good. I had a necklace of fireballs, so on one of my turns I used an action to pull a bead off the necklace of fireballs, shove it in his mouth, and then try to uppercut him to close his mouth on the bead to make it detonate and try and blow him up from the inside. Didn't quite work like that. He did eventually explode, but the explosion also took me out, and then I was down and dying, just a crisp husk on the ground. But that kind of combination of, oh, I've got something interesting that I want to do, let's figure out how many actions it's going to take, let's figure out how within the action economy it's going to work. I felt like I was much freer to say there's something weird that I want to do. I want to do some strange stuff. How can we figure this out, Jim? So now that I have played some PF2 as a player, I feel entirely confident in my recommendation to check this system out. If you want to get into the system, you could do a lot worse than checking out the beginner box. I'll have a link up here comparing the beginner box for PF2 to 5e. But until next time, happy gaming.